Frank Batavick currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Historical Society and is chair of the Society's Publications Committee. Frank's service to the Society spans many years and includes service as board chair. Frank had a very extensive and influential career in television for over 40 years. Frank also worked as the Director of Product Development for the Agency for Instructional Technology, AIT, in Bloomington, Indiana, and Production Branch Chief for the Maryland State Department of Education at Maryland Public Television. His television programs have garnered over 60 national and international awards, including a Peabody and an Emmy. He has also served as adjunct faculty and visiting lecturer in communications at McDaniel College, the University of Maryland, at College Park, Towson State University, and the State University of New York at Fredonia. Frank was one of the co-founders of the New Windsor Heritage Committee in 1983. Remains active with the group. He served as a trustee and then president of the Carroll County Public Library Board of Trustees during the 1980s. Frank received his Master's of Arts degree in radio, television film from the University of Maryland and his undergraduate degree from LaSalle University with a major in English and a minor in philosophy. He's going to speak today about the history of New Windsor, also touch upon his book Times Crossroads, the history of New Windsor. Can we have a round of applause for Frank?
So thanks for coming. It's kind of a dreary, rainy January day, but I appreciate you all being here. Let's hope the technology cooperates. Here we go, Times Crossroads. We moved to New Windsor in 1975, and we lived in this house for 15 years. What we loved about the town is the unchanging nature of it. And there's a picture of Main Street. Our house is right on the right, next to the old hardware store. And that's what it looked like 100 years previously. So it didn't change all that much. Yeah, there are developments up there on the hill, but the main part of town, the architecture, the ambience, is what we loved in New Windsor. Rather than go through the history of New Windsor, I'm going to focus on certain personalities, some famous, some not so famous, but I think you'd be interested in meeting. So the first takes place at the tavern that existed before they built the Dealman Inn. So the area to the right of where you see the porches, that's the original tavern in the town. And they added on the rest about the 1840s. So we're going to go back to 1835. And there was a duel that took place at the tavern. Now here's what happened. There was a character by the name of Moses Cullison who over-imbibed. He also was caught gambling for money, which was a big no-no. And the bartender, Thomas Poole, said, Moses, you're going to have to get out of here. And Moses said, I'm not leaving. And he said, Moses, you have to leave. And he said, you're going to have to drag me out. And so Poole said, I challenge you to a duel. So they both went outside. They had muskets. They loaded them. They paced off. They turned around, and they fired. Well, Thomas Poole fell to the ground. And Moses Cullison went, and he ran down the street. And the crowd chased after him. And he was worried that he'd be charged with murder and hung. So they dragged him back, and as they brought him back to the Dealman Inn, he saw Thomas Poole get up. And everybody started laughing. And Poole said, Cullison, that was a lesson to you. When I tell you to get out, you get out. Now, I never want to see your face again. And he never showed up in town again. So that's the famous duel in New Windsor. I love this picture. This is taken about 1890. But when I see the faces there, they're the kind of guys that were probably involved in that duel. And notice the bottle of booze on top of the little mule there. The guy with the bowler. So it's a great old picture. That's the Dealman Inn on the left. Now we're going to talk about some people during the Civil War. New Windsor didn't have any big battles in the Civil War. It was raided by the Confederates, and we'll get into that in just a second. This was a school for girls. It was an academy, and it was run by Joanna Clayfish in 1863. There was a 16-year-old going there. Her name was Maggie Murray, and she kept a diary. Well, on June 30th, 1863, she looked out her window, and she saw 5,400 cavalry passing by, along with all the wagons and artillery and whatever else they carried with them. The line went all the way from New Windsor to Marston. And those who know that territory, that's a pretty long cavalcade. So she kept a diary, and she saw what was going on, and she went out and she interviewed some of the soldiers. Some stayed the night in the Dealman Inn. They camped. They also camped other places in town. The officers stayed at the Dealman Inn, not all of them, but some of them, and they were on their way to Gettysburg. And she was like a cub reporter, so she talked to them, she wrote down what she found out, all in her diary. And that diary today is in the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And it gives us an idea of what happened during that time. Here we see some cavalry passing through. She also saw the burial of two federal troops. On the way in, one of them died from exhaustion, and on the way back from Gettysburg, one of them died from his wounds. Both are buried in the Presbyterian Church in New Windsor, unmarked graves. Perhaps they had a wooden cross at one time. We don't know where they are right now, but that's where they were buried. Next, we're going to talk about when the Confederates came to town. And on July 9th, 1864, a Confederate raiding party came into Maryland, and they had a bold mission. Their job was to travel all around the top of Maryland, Carroll County, Baltimore County, go down to Point Lookout, free 17,000 Confederate prisoners that were being held there, arm them, and march on Washington. Never happened. But in the course of coming into Maryland, what they did is they needed fresh horses, they needed provisions, supplies, so they raided towns. One of them was New Windsor. And they were being led by General Bradley T. Johnson, who was from Frederick County, and Major Harry Gilmore, who was from Baltimore County. And both those guys were picked because they knew the countryside. They were from the area. I know the fellow in New Windsor who owns Gilmore's pistol. And I visited with him once, and he let me hold that in my hand, so I held Harry Gilmore's pistol, which I thought was pretty cool. They did looting, stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, hams, booze, flour, cornmeal, whatever they could steal, boots. They really were after horses. And in this sketch, which was done by Frederick Dealman when he was only 16 years old, it appeared in Leslie's Illustrated magazine. So you can see the activity going on there and some horses being grabbed right there. Supposedly, nobody was hurt during when this happened, except one woman claimed that she had been shot when they came into town. And they were firing their pistols and trying to get people to turn over their horses. And her name was Ann Gilbert. And she said that as she sat on the front porch of her house at the lower end of Church Street, one of the bullets went through her wrist and grazed the chest of her son who sat on her lap. Well, she claimed that her entire life. In fact, if you read her obituary that appeared in the Union Bridge newspaper, it says that she had been wounded during this skirmish. But some Civil War historians scoffed at that, said it never happened. Well, we were written by a gentleman in 2013. This is the New Windsor Heritage Group. And he said, I have the bullet that wounded my great-great-great-grandmother. Are you interested in having it? We said, yes, and there it is. We have it on display in the museum, which we think is pretty cool. Yeah, I had somebody look at it who knows firearms. They said it's a 44 caliber slug from a cavalry pistol. So we're assuming that's the right one. General Johnson made this house his headquarters when he was in town. And when he was going up the main street, which was called Bath Street in those days, he saw a woman on the front porch. And he said, Nettie, is that you? It turns out that the woman was Nettie Stauffer, who he had gone to school with. Now, this is the Civil War. People knew each other. So she said, yes, it is. Why don't you come in for some tea? So her husband was he supported the federal cause, all right? So he came in for some tea. While they're in there, they're looting the town. They're looting all the stores, including the store across the street owned by her husband. All right? So he looks out and he sees what's going on. He complains to his wife. She tells Bradley to tell them to stop looting. Bradley goes out, stops them from looting, posts guards outside so nobody else loots the place, and goes back to his tea. Little did he know that he was a federal sympathizer, the guy whose store he stopped looting, but he knew Nettie. The main idea of the mission was to steal horses. So they went to an area farm, and they were stealing horses, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Robert McCubbin, and he was part of the raiding party. He was a scout. And McCubbin was stealing horses at this farm right outside of New Windsor, and as he's stealing horses, perhaps with his pistol out, he said, "Would you do me a big favor?" to the farmer he's stealing horses from. The farmer said, "What do you mean, what?" He said, "My family doesn't know whether I'm alive or dead. I've tried to visit them a number of times. They're in Baltimore. Could you get word to them that I'm alive, I have not been wounded by the war?" And the farmer, so the war continues. McCubbin comes marching home to Baltimore, and he says, "I'm home." And they said, "Oh yeah, we know the farmer contacted us. We know you're alive." That's the kind of war it was, where even though his horses had been stolen, he still returned that favor, which I think is a really cool story. Next, we move on to Simon Murdoch. He was a freed black. He belonged to Company F, 4th U.S. Colored Troops. And he was born where routes 97 and 26 meet, but he moved to New Windsor and he built a cabin there. He fought on the Union side. He was injured at Deep Bottom, Virginia, and he was injured in his head, and he had a deep hole in his head, on his forehead here. And this photograph was taken by Julia Cairns. Maybe some of you knew Julia. She lived in New Windsor. She had an antique store, Boxwood Antiques. And when she was a little girl, she took this photograph of Simon. And she said it was very frightening because of that hole in his head. So Slimy came home from the war, and he decided he was going to do something really good. He was one of 3 trustees for the first black school in New Windsor, and he started holding Methodist services in his house, his log house, and then he helped to build the Strawbridge United Methodist Church. So he did some really good in the world when he came back from the war. The next folks are going to be Winfield Scott Drack and Jesse H. Barnes. We'll talk about Jesse first. In 1999, a bundle of letters were found in this house at the Strawbridge Shrine, and perhaps some of you have been there. They were renovating the house, and under some floorboards, they found this bundle of letters. They were written by Kate Woods from New Windsor to Jesse Barnes, a New Windsor guy, in 1862. And they perhaps met at a dance or somehow, but Jesse was in the service, and he was captured at the Battle of the Wilderness. And sent to Andersonville prison. We all know what Andersonville was like in those days. Then he was moved on to Florence, South Carolina, where he died. And those letters, they don't tell us a whole lot. There's Jesse right there. They're just picture love letters from a teenage girl. Okay, so I've read through them, and you don't get any deep messages. They're just kind of interesting to know. But poor Jesse never made it home, never got together with Kate again. Oddly enough, she married a Confederate deserter from Virginia, who somehow made his way to New Windsor. They were both married, and they're both buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery. The next character is Winfield Scott Drack. He's also from New Windsor. He fought in the Battle of the Wilderness, too, and he lost a leg, had to be amputated in one of those field hospitals, and he returned to town, and he had his wooden leg, and he became the postmaster of New Windsor as well as its burgess. So he moved on to a responsible job. Winfield Drack. The next guy is pretty fascinating, Robert Bartholow. He was born in New Windsor in 1831, educated at Calvert College right in town, and the University of Maryland Medical School, and he came back to town and practiced medicine. He also helped found and edit the first newspaper in New Windsor, The True American. And from the name, you maybe get a hint that it was not a middle-of-the-road newspaper. It was a nativist newspaper, one that was completely against immigration, against Catholics, against Jews. You get the idea. So, but he was editor of that for a few years, and then he decided that he needed to join the army. So he did just that, and he joined the army. In 1855, and he served until 1864, so 9 years. He was part of the Mormon Rebellion in Utah, the Indian Wars out west, and the Civil War. So in the course of doing all that, he saw some horrendous injuries, absolutely horrible things that he had to deal with on the battlefield and in battlefield hospitals. And so he learned a great deal about anatomy, medicine, and doing all this. When the war was over, he moved to Cincinnati and the Medical College of Ohio. He used his vast experience to write one of the most influential textbooks of its time, the Practical Treatise, Materia Medica and Therapeutics. This was 738 pages. It was translated into multiple languages, including Japanese. So it was a very influential book. Not only did he do this, he also introduced the stainless steel hypodermic needle. Pretty impressive for a guy from New Windsor. He wrote a book on that, and he also kept on talking about the importance of disinfection in the operating room. Back in those days, they didn't have a clue, and he thought, we have to keep things clean. He had an interest in electricity, and this is where he got into some trouble. He was fascinated by its medical possibilities. And this is a new period here where electricity is being investigated, and they came up with the idea of electrotherapy. If we took the magic of electrical current and applied it to the human body, what good could we do? Well, they started experimenting. First they did it with rabbits and mice and dogs and cats, and then they started experimenting with their brains, inserting electrodes in their brains and playing around with current. And they figured out that certain parts of the brains made you raise your right leg, your left arm. So they figured all these things out by using electrical current. Well, Bartholomew was fascinated by that, and he had a patient. Her name was Mary Rafferty, and she had a 2-inch hole in her head. As a young girl, she had fallen into a fire, singed her head, and an ulcer resulted. And this is before they had good medical care. And there was a hole in her head. So she was a patient of Bartholomew. He examined her and saw this hole in her head, and he went, not a good home. So he took his electrical instruments and electrodes and placed it into that hole, and to see if her arms and legs would kick, and they did. Then he thought, well, what happens if I increase the current? And he kept on increasing the current until she was unconscious and went into a coma. She went into the hospital and she died 3 days later. So that's a horrible thing to do. So he was censured by the American Medical Association. They said, what are you doing that to people? But he went on to write about it, and he was welcomed to the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, one of the most influential medical schools of its time. He published his research there, and some people consider him the father of neurology because of what he was able to figure out about how the human brain works. He died in Philadelphia, but he wanted to be buried back home. So he's buried in the Presbyterian Church Cemetery in New Windsor, Bartholomew. There's a shot of Old Main on the campus of what was Calvert College at the time. And you probably can't read it from where you're sitting. On his faculty, there was a Louis Steelman. You probably can't read that, but that's the name at the top right, Louis Steelman. Now, Louis is an interesting character. He is responsible for New Windsor's first family, the Dealmans. But I'll tell you a little bit about him. He came over in 1845, was a musician from Germany. His brother was teaching music at Mount St. Mary's. He joined his brother, taught there for a while, and then he went to Calvert College in New Windsor and taught German and music. But the Civil War happened. Enrollment was, fell drastically because a lot of the young men joined either the Confederate or the Union forces. So he had no way to support his young family. And he went and bought the Dealman Inn. And he decided to become an innkeeper. And this was the old Brower Tavern on the right, and a part was added to it in 1840 by James Attlee, the son of the town founder. You would go to hear the best music, lectures, meet famous people. And so he had a tremendous impact on that. There's a picture of the Dealman family, a little fuzzy, but that's the picture we have at the New Windsor. So Lewis is at the bottom, you can read the names. There's a Lewis H at the upper left, Frederick, we'll get to in a second, and then two daughters, Agnes and Lena. We're not sure who the women in the middle are. It's not the mother. We don't know who they are. Okay, so there are the sons. There's Frederick on the left and Lewis on the right. And this is taken in the gardens of the Dealman Inn. And they're the two daughters, Lena and Agnes. They ran the inn until 1927. So they're apparently peeling apples with a little boy who perhaps was a son of one of the people who worked at the inn. And there's Frederick Dealman. Frederick went on to become one of the most famous artists of his time. He did multiple sketches for all kinds of newspapers and magazines. He illustrated Longfellow's poetry. His illustrations were in the Century magazine, in Scribner's magazine. He was also an artist, and did paintings that are hanging today in museums across the country. He did the mural for the lobby of the Washington Star in D.C., the Washington Star newspaper. So he was a quite accomplished guy. His brother was also very accomplished, Lewis H. Dealman. He was most famous for what he gave us concerning doing research on family roots. And you'll see here the newspapers in front of him. Dealman received newspapers from all across the state. And he would clip out the obituaries from the newspapers and glue them to little index cards. He'd also go to the cemetery, and he would write down all the inscriptions on cemeteries all across the state and put them on little index cards. And he was trying to create a definitive record of people who had lived in Maryland and are buried in Maryland. And if you go to the Maryland Center for History and Culture, you'll find the Dealman Hayward card file. Somebody else by the name of Hayward did the same kind of thing, so they matched both collections, and if you go there, you can research all kinds of people who lived in Maryland during those years, and it's been invaluable to people who are tracing their family roots. One wonderful thing about Dealman was he was a photographer, an amateur photographer at the time, and he took wonderful, wonderful pictures of small-town life. And it's a great record of what it was like to live in New Windsor back in those days. And that's pretty cool, but he also documented black life in New Windsor, which was an unusual thing in those times. So in his photographic collection, and we have the original glass slides at New Windsor Heritage, you'll find a lot of pictures of African Americans. Here's the group working behind the Dealman Inn preparing dinner, and they're husking some corn. So he took these great pictures that we have now as this record of small-town life. So that's Mr. Lou's hat, Mr. Lou's photograph, and all kinds of little memorabilia things. Not his typewriter, it's an old typewriter I have, but it belonged to Mr. Lou. This gives you an appreciation for the kinds of things that he did. He was the town pharmacist, postmaster, and commissioner in town, justice of the peace, editor, Maryland Historical Magazine, executive secretary, Peabody Institute, chairman, Maryland Historical Society's Library Committee, co-founder and first president of the Maryland Library Association, co-creator of the Dealman Hayward card file at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, town historian and amateur photographer. What a guy, huh? So, a protean accomplishments, okay? Unbelievable. So, a lot of what we have about the history of New Windsor and Carroll County, we owe to that man. There's a nice picture of the Dealman Inn. It was, as I said, a center of culture for the county and for the area. People came to the Dealman Inn to stay during the summer when the cities were almost unlivable because of the waste of the streets, the heat, the humidity. They just had to get out of the city, and they would come into the country and stay in a place like the Dealman Inn. So you can see a whole group of folks up there on the left and on the right. And then there's some wonderful pictures. These are all taken by Dealman, by the way. So he left us the treasure. And he developed his own photographs. And he came up with a technique, which I forget what it's called, where you can make your prints blue. So a lot of the pictures we have are blue like this. You can through Photoshop and your computer, you can make them black and white, but I kept them blue because Mr. Lou wanted them blue. So just lovely little pictures of the kids who stayed at the Dealman Inn. And these are taken in the garden. There's some ladies at a costume party enjoying tea in the garden. And that shows you the formal gardens of the Dealman Inn. By the way, that's all gone today. The Dealman Inn is still there, but all the shrubs, the boxwood hedges, all gone. It's on the market. We hope somebody is able to buy it. The town owns it right now. And they put on amateur theatricals at the Dealman Inn. They have musical recitals. That's Mr. Dealman's brother on the violin there, a famous composer. And so you went there for high culture, and you got it at the Dealman Inn. They also were very welcoming to artists. That's Julia Cairns as a young woman sitting in front of a cottage that was built just for artists at the Dealman Inn. It's no longer there. They have a parking lot there now. But they would go into there, and you can see how they tried to capture the light through that window, and they would do their drawing. And they would do paintings, they do sketches, and the cool thing is, that leaf I just showed you, I have the plaster model for it that I got from Julia. And there's a plaster head that they used to sketch, the people who stayed there. And that was given to me by her daughter just recently in the past year. So I have all these wonderful things that are evidence of the Dealman Inn and the culture that it represented. The sundial. I kind of adopted the sundial as the motif for my research. It's on the front cover of my book. And the sundial is really cool because if you look at the inscription, we have this now today in the museum because it was stolen once. We got it back, and we now have it in the museum. If you look on the sundial, it says C.L. Woolley fetch it, meaning C.L. Woolley made this. Okay? And you say, well, okay, fine, C.L. Woolley, who was he? He was one of the most famous archaeologists of the time who stayed at the Dealman Inn. And there he is there. He discovered the ancient city of Ur. So he was a pretty famous guy. He was a guest at the Dealman Inn. Another famous person is Marion P. Moss. He was born in Burnt Hills, Maryland, in 1850 and went to West Point and graduated from there in 1874. His first assignment were the Indian Wars. And he fought the Lakota. There's a Sitting Bull on the left. And also he was helped capture Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians, all right? So he had this experience in fighting in the Indian Wars. The next assignment he had was to capture Geronimo. So he went off to the borderlands between Mexico and the U.S. to see if he could find Geronimo. And Geronimo has a fierce look on his face right there, and I'm sure he was a fierce warrior. One of the times when he was looking for Geronimo in the Sierra Madre Mountains, he was ambushed by Geronimo. And one of his troopers was shot and was lying out there in front of him. And Moss crawled out, grabbed the trooper, dragged him back to safety, and continued to exchange fire with Geronimo and his men. Geronimo saw that and said he really respected a man who would do that under fire. And when he was interviewed later on, Geronimo said, that guy is an impressive soldier. So they kept on trying to capture Geronimo until they Geronimo sent some of his braves to meet with Moss, and he said, he's tired of running. He wants to surrender. And Moss said, bring him to me. So they brought Geronimo to Moss, and there he is. Among Moss's troops, there's some of the other Apaches on the upper ranks. And so they had him in the camp. And they were so delighted to have fulfilled their mission that they started drinking and drinking and drinking. They all got drunk, the soldiers, and guess what happened? Geronimo escaped. So Marion Moss is credited with having captured Geronimo, not so much. But anyway, that's one of his credits. He was given the Silver Star in 1890 for gallantry. He was promoted to captain. Then he was sent back to fight the Sioux. 2 times he was wounded. After that, he was told to investigate the horrible massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And he became a hero of the Old West. And here's a wonderful picture of Buffalo Bill, General Nelson Miles, Frank Baldwin, and Marion Moss, all together on horseback. And they were heroes back then, you know, when the West was this romantic thing. He eventually was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the highest award you can get in the military, and you see that around his neck. And he retired to Rockville, Maryland. So if you're paying attention, you're saying, wait. Born in Burn Hills, Maryland, retired to Rockville. Why are we talking about him, about New Windsor? Well, he and his wife came here to the Dealman Inn every summer from 1917 to 1930. It was their favorite resort. His wife, Maddie Lindsay, would stay there. He'd ride around town in a chauffeured limousine. They worshiped across the street at St. Paul's Church. And he died at the age of 79 in the inn, in the brick part right there on the left. He died in that area. So that's why he's part of this presentation. The next group of people I'm going to introduce you to are the Bloom sisters. The Bloom sisters had one sister and two brothers, and their parents were Adam and Mary Bloom. They lived in that house that still stands in New Windsor. That's where the family was raised. To get a better perspective, there's the house. It was next to the railroad tracks. The train station was where you see that white car on the right. So all this is gone, of course. So there was a train station. Next to the house, there was an ice cream factory that Adam Bloom owned. And he was very, very successful. These photographs I'm showing you came from an album owned by Estelle Bloom, one of the Bloom sisters. And when she passed away, they had an auction of all of her items. Julia Cairns bought the photographs, and we have that album at the Heritage Museum. And so there's just a page of all the photographs. There's a Mencken, we'll get to him in a second, and you can see where they come from. There's the house with the Mary Bloom on the left, one of the boys in the middle, and I'm not sure who that is on the far right, and a swing set they have there. And there's a shot of the house, and in the far distance on the left is the ice cream factory. Yeah. So he lived there, raised his family, had the factory right there, and the train station was next door where he could ship the ice cream. Okay, so it was a great setup for him. And there's a shot of the ice cream factory after it was sold to the Lance brothers. When Adam Bloom died, the Lance brothers bought it, so that's what it looked like. It was right next to the house that I showed you. Now there's Marion on the left and Estelle on the right. In this picture, they look pretty distinctive, but in a lot of photographs, you don't know who they are, because they were very pretty women, and they kind of, is that Marion or is that Estelle? And there's even a book that I'll be showing you in a second, where the author says, I'm not sure which one this is, but there they are, Marion and Estelle in this picture. St. Paul's Methodist Church, in January 1898, it had a revival for all their congregants, and the Bloom family went. There was a preacher that was invited, by the name of Jenny Smith, and she was one of those fire and brimstone teachers, okay, or preachers rather. And after she preached, she would demand that you come up, if you've been saved, to receive her blessing. All those who've been saved, come forward. And they would come forward, and she'd give them their blessing. Well, the Bloom family all got up and went forward, except Adam Bloom didn't. Adam Bloom sat there, and he said, I just don't feel saved. I'm not feeling it. So he didn't get up and go forward. Well, he already suffered from severe depression, which is not a good thing. He went home and he agonized about the fact that he wasn't saved. And he was sure that he was going to go to hell. So he got more and more depressed, spiraling down, until he went up in the attic one day with a shotgun and took his own life, okay? Unfortunately, he was not good at that. He didn't shoot in the right place, he shot in the gut. He lingered for a few days before he actually died. And he never went into the hospital, he stayed home and suffered in a side room. And this had a tremendous impact on the Bloom girls and the family. There's Mary Bloom, the mom. She had a disability. She had fallen out of bed as a baby and they think broken her hip or something. In those days, they didn't take kids right away to the hospital. They figured, oh, she'll be fine. Well, she was never quite fine, and she had pain her whole life, and she walked with a limp. We all know this from the writings that Estelle did, all right? She had a limp. She was known to be cranky, and she was very severe with the girls. And for some reason, she picked on Estelle. And Estelle became the Cinderella character. It was Estelle who had to do the dishes, Estelle who had to do the house cleaning, Estelle who had to do this. There were 2 other sisters, but Estelle got picked on all the time. So Estelle started dating a soldier when she was only about 17, 18, who was 36 years old. He was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And her mother said, you're not going to date this guy. Well, she did. He invited her to go to Baltimore. Estelle had never been to Baltimore. It was the magic city for her. So they went down to the train station, got on a train, went to Baltimore, and saw the sights of the big city. They came back that night. She was locked out. Her mother wouldn't let her back in. She stayed the night with a neighbor, and the neighbor said, your mom was not going to let you back in because you disobeyed her. So she had to move to Baltimore. So she moved to Baltimore and sought work. She worked in a shirt factory for a while. She worked in a telephone exchange. She worked for the Chesapeake Iron Works. She was still really free-spirited. She dated a lot. Now, for those of you who like art history, that's an odalisque. And if you can Google that and come up with dozens and dozens of odalisques that show a woman in a reclining position, both with and without clothes, okay? It was a common way that artists painted women back in those days. And this is one by Emil Eisman Simonowski. Well, apparently Estelle had seen odalisques, and so you find a lot of times where she's posing exactly like that. Not just on cabinets in the office where she works, which would be a little unusual, but also at the beach. She liked doing it at the beach too, so that's Estelle. She met a German immigrant, Hans Kubitz, and she fell in love with him, and they were married. And there's a picture of her brother Truman on the left, and of course Estelle in the middle. Well, Kubitz was not the marrying kind, but he married Estelle, and he goes on a national tour with Truman. And they go all over the place. They go west, they go to Mexico, and she never sees him again. They send postcards. We have the postcard at the museum that he sent her, but he never returned home. Finally, Truman wrote her and said, what I've seen of this man tells me he's not worthy of marriage. You need to dump him. But he never came back. So that didn't matter whether she could dump him or not. This is a photograph we have, and you can picture who was on the right. She cut him out of this photograph. Okay? So much for Hans. Well, she had to have some kind of resolution. She's still a married woman, even though he disappeared. So the 2 sisters got together, and they tried to figure out, what are they going to do? So one of them got the idea that maybe we can go see H.L. Mencken, who is one of the most famous newspaper guys in the country. He knows everything. He'll help us find your husband. So they go down to meet H.L. Mencken, and they talk to him about helping to find Hans. Of course, he can't help them find. Hans is someplace out west. How's he going to do that? However, let me talk about him a little bit. He was the editor and founder of Smart Set, a magazine of cleverness, if you can read that. And it had all kinds of cute little drawings and poetry in it. But he also did things more serious. He also published the American Mercury magazine, which was a very highbrow literary review. And he did the book, The American Language, which is a definitive study of English, the American language. So he did things like that, and he did lowbrow things. So his most famous event was when he covered the Scopes monkey trial. And he covered it in a clever way, and his columns were syndicated across the country, and everybody got to know who H.L. Mencken was. He became nationally famous. He meets Marion when they go to see him at the Baltimore Sun, and he falls in love with Marion. She's a lovely woman. So he falls in love with her. They start dating. He comes to New Windsor. Here's a picture taken in the house I showed you, with Mencken in the front and Marion in the back. She's got a thumbprint on her face, but she has a glass of beer or something up to her lips, but it's hard to make that out. And she didn't take any really good pictures of Mencken. I wish she had, but all the pictures are kind of fuzzy. It was the photography of its time, although some of the pictures are not bad. So what happens is they fall in love, they start dating. He introduces her to Theodore Dreiser. all right, his good buddy. Now, Dreiser was a famous American novelist. He had written An American Tragedy, and that was a runaway bestseller. It became very, very famous. They wrote a Broadway play based on it. There were 3 movies based on it, including this one here with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor called A Place in the Sun. But it's basically the same story of ambition and love and betrayal. So it became a very, very famous property. And both sisters were avid readers. In fact, Mencken nicknamed Marion Bloom because of her fondness for Russian novelists like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. So, but the girls read all the time. I should say the women read all the time, and that attracted them to the men too, who were literary lions. So you had these 2 very famous writers, and you had these 2 beautiful women, and they were, 2 couples for a while. They either met at the Bloom house or they met at Goldie's house. Now, Goldie was the 3rd Bloom sister, and she lived in that house right off of Springdale Road. And they would have their romantic trysts at this house right there. Marion kept on waiting for Mencken to pop the question, and he never popped the question. So she said, if you're not going to get married with me, I'm going to find something else to do, and she did. She became a nurse during World War I. And Truman and Preston, her brothers, both enlisted. She became a nurse, and she went over to France, and she ministered to the troops in France. Marion, meanwhile, she comes home, and she marries a guy by the name of Lou Maritzer. And Lou was a womanizer. This marriage didn't work out. He left her high and dry. And she goes back to Mencken. Now, she dated Mencken for 13 years, okay? No engagement. No proposal to get married. So finally, she just gave up on Mencken. Mencken, here he is with Eileen Pringle, who was a Hollywood star. He dated her for a while. And then he married a Sarah Hart in 1930. And she was a Goucher grad. She ended up being a professor at Goucher. She had written novels, published short stories. She was a writer. That impressed Mencken. He married her. She died in 35 of meningitis, so that's unfortunate. But she never happened to marry. So a book was written. It has the letters of both of them. Edward A. Martin is the author. And if you're interested in the correspondence of between Mencken and Marion, writing back and forth, it's in that book. So it's fascinating reading. Now, Estelle, she goes on and she marries Arthur P. Williams, president of a company that was an importer of fine foods, wines, liquors, etc. He was wealthy. She could afford to dress well, so she didn't have to worry about what to wear. He traveled the world with her. This is a colored etching of Prague that Estelle bought. Dory bought this from me from Julia and gave it to me as a present, so we own that. But so they traveled the world, and she lived in this house in Connecticut, a huge mansion in Connecticut with Arthur Williams. They were able to support her infirm mother back in New Windsor. They didn't own the house at the time. They had owned it at one point and went to the bank because they couldn't afford to pay for it. So Arthur Williams, who had all this money, bought the house and gave it to the mother, which was a lovely thing to do. But he was unfaithful. And she left him, and she goes to New York to live. So she lived in New York for a while. There's that pose that she seemed to prefer all the time. And she lived in New York for a while, and then she decided that New York wasn't for her, and she went and she moved back to her family home in New Windsor, where that was the mom had owned. She did that in 1937. She used to go back to New York a lot of times, and she would go back and buy a fine food, a good wine and liquor, and she'd bring it back to New Windsor. And then she'd go on her shopping trips, and she would dress in her finery, and apparently, from what I've read, she'd wear long gloves and a hat and get on the train and go up to New York and do her shopping and come home. Later on in life, she wasn't able to do that, so she would order things. They'd be delivered to the Railway Express office in New Windsor, and she'd ask her brother to go pick up packages and of fine food and wine, and her brother would do that. I've talked to people who remember her when they were kids. These are people older than I am, and they said, "Oh yeah, I remember Estelle." she used to sit out there. That's a door right there. It's now a window. You can see where the door is in the middle. She'd come out that door and she'd sit on the porch and she'd read. And we called her the crazy old woman. She stayed there. Eventually she got very ill. She contracted breast cancer and she couldn't leave the house any longer. And she died in the house. Her brother discovered her, and she's buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery in New Windsor. So they're the Bloom sisters. They're archetypes for women who've been used and abused by men, unfortunately. Not a pleasant story, but the idea that they were dating these two icons of American literature is a pretty cool story, I think. And I think it'd be great subjects for someone to write a novel or do a movie on or whatever. That's it for my talk. I've got copies of my book. Anybody interested in buying it, I'll be sitting back there, and I can sign copies for you if you're interested. All proceeds go to the Historical Society. All right? So thanks for your attention. I hope you enjoyed it.
Any questions? Then Frank will have to ask you to repeat the question.
Okay, I will.
Any questions? Yeah, Amy.
Can you tell us about how you got the Brower Tavern book?
Oh, yeah.
What was that question?
Okay. How did we get the Brower Tavern? It's a barbell, a huge barbell is what it is. We have a book at the Heritage Committee that is about this high, that wide, and it goes from, it's all in my book, and I'm lousy with remembering dates, but it goes from something like 1804 to 1815. Don't hold me to that date, but roughly. And what it is a huge barbell of all the people who drank at the Brower's Tavern. And he has their name, and they're all the founding fathers of New Windsor. And that's how we knew it was ours. The backstory to that is a woman owned it. I forget where she is, someplace out west or down south. And her family had owned this book for years and years and years. And at the top of the page it says N Windsor, N Windsor, N Windsor. So she figured out it was New Windsor. So she wrote every town called New Windsor, and there are a bunch of them in this country, and said, is this yours, is this yours, is this yours? So she wrote us, and we said, well, what are some of the names in there? And she told us the names were Frizzell and just names that were New Windsor founders. And we said, yeah, that sounds like belongs to New Windsor. So we have it, and it does have all the names of the founding fathers in it and what they drank. And they drank not just ale, they drank complicated cocktails in those days, which I didn't know they did. And, besides whiskey and beer, they drank, it'll say cocktail. I'm thinking, I wonder what the cocktail was. But it has all their names and checked off, so that's one of our treasures. And I've given talks about that. And come to the New Windsor Heritage Museum and you'll see it, and it's pretty cool. Does that answer your question? Okay, good.
Anyone else? We got this mic working now. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right here. Here you go.
Do you know who owns the Bloom household now?
No, I don't. No. I took those photos not asking permission. No. Jack.
Oh, over here,
Yeah.
Jack.
Frank, where did you get all that amazing information about the Bloom sisters? And did you ever consider writing the book about that?
I have, and I've actually written a couple chapters, or at least one chapter. I need to get myself moving on that before Father Time takes over. Estelle wrote about her experiences. When she married, she thought that she owed her husband an explanation of the kinds of things that she had done in her life. So she wrote a long, long letter to him of all the experiences. And this letter appears in a book that Bryce Workman wrote. It's a booklet. You can buy it at the New Windsor Heritage Committee. And what he did is he took the letter and put it in his book, and then he wrote about the Bloom sisters. So Bryce Workman, who's not with us any longer, he was a member of the Heritage Committee and the Historical Society. He did a lot of this research on the two women. And I had access to his research. When he passed away, His widow gave all his research to New Windsor Heritage. I've been going through it all, okay? So I've got access to that. So I've got the booklet he published, the research he did, and the photo album, and God bless it, Google. You find a lot of stuff on Google, which you hope is correct. So that's where it all came from. But it's, you know, and it's like doing it's trying to solve a mystery, trying to fill in the blanks. So I'm sure it's not definitive. You know, Bryce would probably do something more definitive. Bryce was a historian. I consider myself a popularizer. I'm not, you know, I don't do the kind of research Bryce did. Okay, anybody else?
Galen, here you go.
Frank, what are the hours for the museum? What are the hours in New Windsor for the museum? When is that open?
It's open on Saturdays only, from 10 to 1. When we can find a docent. By the way, I am the docent this Saturday, so if anybody wants to stop by. A cool story there. Mimi mentioned the tavern book. I mentioned the bullet, okay? These are things that people contact us and they say, we have these, do you want them? Of course we do. I was recently contacted, I'm going to say 2 months ago, by a woman, and she said, I have the registration book for the Dealman Inn. And I said, what? So she may have a lot of famous people in there who stayed there. And she said, would you like it? I said, yeah. So I'm meeting her this Saturday at the museum, and she's going to give it to me. And I'm really anxious to kind of cross-reference the names in there to see if they are. We're told that, but we know that Moss stayed there. His name has got to be in there. We're told that a lot of other famous people stayed there, senators and representatives and governors and social register people from New York and Philadelphia. So it could be a treasure trove of research. So Mimi, you would love looking at this too. So I will have it as of, I hope. I made a big mistake. I talked to her on the phone and she said, are you interested? I said, oh yeah, there's probably a lot of famous names in there. And I went, uh-oh, because their signatures are going to be there. So she, you know, I hope she shows up on Saturday. I should have kept my mouth closed. Okay, anybody else?
One more, another question here.
Okay.
Do you have the information about the college, the Calvert College, and what came after that and the history of that?
Yeah, it's all in my book. It was New Windsor College, and then it was moved up the street. It became a Catholic college, of all things. Baker was a devout Catholic. He had gone to Mount St. Mary's. He wanted to see a Catholic college in town. He built Old Main. He also built a church. So there was a Catholic chapel, St. Thomas's, in New Windsor, long gone, torn down. And it then became New Windsor College, no, Blue Ridge College. And then the property was sold. Blue Ridge College used to be in Union Bridge, and the kids couldn't breathe because of the dust from the cement plant. In all seriousness, they couldn't. When we first moved, and this is not to knock a local industry because they employ a lot of people. When we first moved here, if you went to Union Bridge, everybody's cars were filled with dust. That's how it was. You ever remember that? And I couldn't believe it that people were living here. Well, they cleaned up their act. I mean, the EPA and all that stuff. So it's not true today. It's a great industry and employs a lot of people. But there was a day when they had a college there and the kids could barely breathe, so they moved it to New Windsor, where the air was much fresher. Anybody else? Wow, thanks for your attention. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Frank.